Buenos tardes. This is My Spy Texas coming to you from Dallas, and I have some books I'm looking at. I'm thinking to read from one of them. One is all about Texas cactus. The plural of cactus is cacti. The other book is Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. I think I'm going to start with part 4, chapter 18. We are deep into the story, and here we go. After the conversation with Alexei, Vronsky went out into the steps of the Karenina house and stood still, with difficulty remembering where he was and where he should walk or drive. He felt disgraced, humiliated, guilty, and deprived of all possibility of washing away his humiliation. He felt thrust out of the beaten track along which he had so proudly and lightly walked till then. All the habits and rules of his life that had seemed so firm had turned out suddenly false and inapplicable. The betrayed husband, who had figured till that time as a pitiful creature, an incidental and somewhat ludicrous obstacle to his happiness, had suddenly been summoned by her herself and elevated to an awe-inspiring pinnacle, and on that pinnacle the husband had shown himself not malignant, not false, or ludicrous, but kind, straightforward, dignified. Vronsky could not feel this, and parts were suddenly reversed. Vronsky felt that Karenina's elevation and his own abasement, Karenina's rightness, his own wrongdoing. He felt that the husband was magnanimous, even in his sorrow, while he had been base and petty in his deceit. But his sense of his own humiliation before the man he had unjustly despised made up only a small part of his misery. He felt unutterably wretched now, for his passion for Anna, which had seemed of late to be growing colder, now that he knew he had lost her forever, was stronger than ever before. He had learned to know her completely in her illness, and had come to know her very soul. It seemed to him that he had never loved her till then. And now, when he learned to know her, to love her as she should be loved, he had been humiliated before her, and he had lost her forever, leaving with her nothing of himself but a shameful memory. Most terrible of all had been his ludicrous, shameful position when Alexei had pulled his hands away from his humiliated face. He stood on the steps of Karenina's house like one distraught and did not know what to do. Here's a little aside. What do you do when you don't know what to do in Russia? You call a sleigh or get the porter. I think they mentioned the word ludicrous about 5 times there, and there's a lot about humiliation and shame. Let's see what else happens. A sleigh, sir? Asked the porter. Yes, a sleigh. On getting home after 3 sleepless nights, Vronsky, without undressing, lay down flat on the sofa, clasping his hands and laying his head on them. His head was heavy. Well, of course it's heavy. He's just thinking too much. Images, memories, ideas of the strangest description followed one another with extraordinary rapidity and vividness. First, it was the medicine that he had poured for the patient and spilled all over the spoon. Then the midwife's white hands, and then the strange position of Alexei on the floor beside the bed. To sleep, to forget, he said to himself with the serene confidence of a healthy man. If he is tired and sleepy, will go to sleep at once. At the same instant, he felt his head did begin to feel drowsy, and he began to drop off into forgetfulness. When all at once, it was as though a violent shock of electricity had passed over him. He started so that he leapt up on the springs of the sofa, and leaning on his arms, he got to his knees in panic. His eyes were wide open, though he had not been asleep. The heaviness in his head and the weariness in his limbs that he had felt a minute before had suddenly gone. "You may trample me in the mud," he heard Alexei say, and saw him standing before him. He saw Anna's face with its burning cheeks, glittering eyes, and gazing with love and tenderness, not at him, but at Alexei. He saw his own, as he had imagined, foolish and ludicrous figure when Alexei took his hands away from his face. He stretched out his legs again and flung himself on the sofa in the same position and shut his eyes. To sleep, he repeated to himself. But with his eyes shut, he saw more distinctly than ever before Anna's face, as it had been on the memorable evening before the races. That is not and will not be, and she wants to wipe it out of her memory. But I cannot live without it. How can we be reconciled? How can we be reconciled? He said aloud and unconsciously began to repeat these words. This repetition prevented fresh images and memories which he felt were thronging in his brain. But repeating words did not check his imagination for long. Again, in extraordinary rapid succession, his happiest moments rose before his mind, and then his recent humiliation. "Take away his hands," Anna's voice says. He takes away his hands, and he feels the shame-struck and idiotic expression on his face. He still lay down, trying to sleep, though he felt there was not the smallest hope in it, and kept repeating stray words from some chain of thought, trying by this to check the rising flood of fresh images. He listened and heard a strange, mad whisper, words repeating, "I did not appreciate it, did not make enough of it. I did not appreciate it, I did not make enough of it." "What's this? Am I going out of my mind?" he said to himself. Perhaps. What makes men go out of their minds? What makes men shoot themselves? He answered himself and opened his eyes. He saw with wonder an embroidered cushion beside him, done by Varya, his brother's wife. He touched the tassel of the cushion and tried to think of Varya, and when he had seen her last. But to think of anything extraneous was an agonizing effort. No, I must sleep. The cushion picked up and he pressed his head into it, but he had to make an effort to keep his eyes shut. He jumped up and sat down. "That's all over for me," he said to himself. "I must think of what to do, what is left." His mind rapidly ran through his life apart from his love of Anna. Ambition, society, the court. He could not come to pause anywhere. All of it had meaning before, but now there was no reality to it. He got up from the sofa, took off his coat and undid his belt, uncovering his hairy chest to breathe more freely. He walked up and down the room. "This is how people go mad," he repeated, "and how they shoot themselves to escape humiliation." He went to the door and closed it. Then, with staring eyes and clenched teeth, he went to the table, took a revolver, looked around him, turned it to the loaded chamber, and sank into thought. For 2 minutes his head bent forward. An expression of intense concentration was on his face. He stood with the revolver in his hand, motionless, thinking. Of course, he said to himself, as though a logical, continuous, and clear chain of reasoning had brought him to the indubitable conclusion. In reality, this, of course, seemed convincing to him, simply the result of exactly the same circle of memories and images through which he had passed 10 times already during the last hours. Memories of happiness lost forever. There was the same conception of the senselessness of everything to come in life, the same consciousness of humiliation. Even the sequence of these images and emotions was the same. Of course, he repeated to himself for the third time. His thought passed again around the same spellbound circle of memories and images, and pulling the revolver to the left side of his chest, clutching it vigorously with his whole hand, as though clenching his fist, he pulled the trigger. He did not hear the sound of the shot, but a violent blow in his chest sent him reeling. He tried to clutch at the edge of the table, dropped the revolver, staggered, and sat down on the floor, looking about himself in astonishment. He did not recognize the room as he looked up from the floor at the curved legs of the table, and the wastepaper basket, and the tiger skin rug. The hurried, creaking steps of the servant coming through the drawing room brought him to his senses. He made an effort at thought and was aware that he was on the floor, and he saw blood on the tiger skin rug and on his arm, and he knew he had shot himself. Idiotic. Missed, he said, fumbling for the revolver. The revolver was close to him. He searched farther away. Still feeling for it, he stretched out to the other side, and not being strong enough to keep his balance, he fell over, streaming with blood. The elegant, whiskered servant, who used to continually complain to his acquaintances of the delicacy of his nerves, was so panic-stricken on seeing his master lying on the floor that he left him to bleed to death while he ran for assistance. An hour later, Varya, his brother's wife, had arrived, and with the assistance of 3 doctors, whom she had sent for in all directions, and who appeared at the same moment, she got the wounded man to bed and remained there to nurse him.